So welcome everybody, and welcome to Cadell, our guest, who I've invited on this evening to talk on the topic of leading the spirit. And this conversation comes at an interesting time because Cadell has just finished up his second course with Philosophy Portal on Nietzsche's "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," and is now putting together the anthology for that course called Spiritual Leadership for the 21st Century, with a conference coming up at the end of the month. So that topic is very much there. At the same time, we're just coming off the end of the first Philosophy Portal retreat in France, which a number of us present in this meeting were at. And I guess you might say it's been the first attempt at a retreat coming straight out of the IDW and the kind of associated philosophical movement here. And so probably some reflections and some learnings from that retreat will come into this as well. Please mute yourself if you're coming in. And with that said, hello, welcome, Cadell, and let's go straight into the deep end, right? We wouldn't want to do anything else. So why spiritual leadership? What the fuck are we talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks for the introduction. Why spiritual leadership? I think it's sort of well known in our various circles that perhaps the most famous signifier that gets repeated over and over is the meaning crisis. But oftentimes what's not associated with that idea is the way in which meaning is related to authority, or the way in which not only is meaning in crisis today, but also authority is in a type of crisis. And this authority actually has roots that we can trace back to the birth of the modern world itself. When I say trace back to the birth of the modern world, I'm talking about the birth of modern political organizations, roughly coinciding with the birth of, let's say, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, where we have a total transition from a view of the world which allows us to suture authority into one figure or one family or one organization, which has a type of divine connection. So why do we follow this certain king? Why do we follow this certain pope? It's because they have some sort of divine connection to God. They have some sort of connection to divine authority. In Europe and in history textbooks, you'll look this up, and it's just called the divine right of kings. And there was a big movement in the French Revolution and the American Revolution to break away from this. And in breaking away from this, we instituted what we could call our modern forms of secular democracy. But those modern forms of secular democracy are, let's say, socially messy. They're extraordinarily complex, but they have functioned in the modern developed Western world for 2 centuries, which isn't that much time. If you think about how long divine political authority was governing, for example, the construction of the Egyptian Empire, for example, which is going on for 3,000-4,000 years. 200 years is not that much time. And I think what we're going through right now is a confrontation with how fragile and how unstable those forms of secular democratic representation actually are. And the sort of deep confrontation with what makes an authority figure an authority figure. Why follow this person over that person? Why follow, why vote for X over Y? And does my vote even matter? Coming deeper down to forms of sort of confronting the discord between democracy and capitalism, for example, where you have the nation state form being totally decoupled from its capacity to regulate global capital. And you can say, well, why am I even bothering to engage with these democratic forms of representation? And things are sort of splintering down to the point where we're, doing these types of things. We're like, instead of engaging with the university system, which is run by state forces, let's just create our own university. And just to sort of hammer this point home on leadership a little bit more, connecting it to the theme of Nietzsche and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's a fantastic passage in the fourth and final part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra where Zarathustra is confronting two kings. And these two kings actually represent what I was talking about, the divine right of kings. And these two kings are basically saying, the time of kings is past. In the past, kings had a meaning. In the past, kings had a significance. But now kings are kind of empty representatives of the rabble, which is a great sort of foreshadowing for phenomena like Trump or Biden or whoever is sort of the empty representation of the rabble today. And in those dialogues that Zarathustra has with the two kings, what they all agree on is that it's not that we should discard with kings for the rabble. It's that we have to discard with kings to find out what really it means to be a king, or what it really means to be an overman. Like when we think about and the notion of king is connected to overman, in Nietzsche at least. And just to sort of elaborate on that a little bit, of course, kings in the past were, it was just an inheritance through a bloodline, right? They didn't win being a king through experience. They didn't win, and to discard with the notion of king, they didn't win being a leader through experience and through spiritual development. They won being a king just simply by birth. And so then the question arises is, what does it mean to become a leader naturally through hard-won experience? And I think that's sort of at least where the question starts to form, as it relates to the contemporary time, spiritual leadership in our time, is we do need people. We can't just have this ideology, and then I'll pass it back to you, Owen, but we can't just have this ideology of distributed intelligence over centralized intelligence. For example, distributed intelligence is good, centralized intelligence is bad. This is the type of moral juxtaposition that often goes on in the sciences. It's a type of moral juxtaposition that goes on in contemporary ideology because there's something taboo, there's something unnerving, there's something unsettling about thinking about someone who has a disproportionate control, disproportionate power, disproportionate leadership over other people. Basically thinking about the subtle dynamics of hierarchy. And I think we do need to think about the subtle dynamics of hierarchy when we're brought to these small scale organizations that we're building on the web and sort of legitimization of things like authority and power, which I do think are connected to the meaning crisis. So I'll end there.
All right, there's two directions I want to go there, because the follow-up to that is obviously like, what are some of these small scale dimensions of authority and hierarchy and leadership that you think we need to pay attention to that perhaps we're being unconscious about at the moment? I'm not taking seriously enough.
Yeah, I'll start with like my doctoral thesis. I'll start with like some concrete experience from what was going on there in my psychic economy. One, I was working on a topic called the global brain, which had the idea of distributed intelligence as its foundation. And there's this idea that in the future, we'll get away with centralized organizations and we'll just have everything sort of self-organizing on the web. And so that allows us to sort of get away from traditional structures. And we don't have to think about the, let's say, difficult tensions that arise in sort of hierarchical organizations. But if I'm going back to my doctoral thesis and looking at the sections which I would totally rewrite, it would be those sections. And that was just informed by my institute sort of paradigm. And the reason why I sort of came to see this as a big problem was in my doctoral institute itself. I was in a small group where my PhD supervisor wanted us to imagine that we were all an egalitarian organization, meaning we're all equal. We're all just a community of spirit. We're all. This is just an open space. It's open-ended, But what I think this obfuscates is the fact that there are people in the Institute who have decades more of experience. There are people in the Institute that have much more social clout or social credibility or political power or scientific credibility, right? Or there are people who have tenured positions and who have lifetime guaranteed money, and there are people who don't. There are people who are just on short-term contracts and who are going to have to shift and move around for the next 10 years, right? So I think when we imagine that we're all just an egalitarian community of spirit, what we're doing is we're obfuscating the actual thought of concrete tensions as they relate to power, money, also sexuality. That also came up because certain people could hire certain people based on unconscious sexual preferences. That was also going on, right? So in order to think these little problems of hierarchy, we have to be able to think what I would call the cuts or the gaps of our social lives related to sex, power, money. Other things also involved, not just those things. But that's a start.
Okay, maybe where we can go with this now is drilling a bit deeper into this notion of spirit itself, because it's one of the things that's become kind of popular in you might say post-secular discourse is a return to spirituality, whether of a religious bent or a new age bent, often going towards a kind of Eastern spiritualism. At the same time, you then have the kind of scientific rationalists who reject the idea of spirit or spirituality as being just a kind of outdated religious crap from the past. And then you have the Hegelian notion of spirit, which is something that is present in the discourses that we work within. And there's that famous line that Hegel saying, "Spirit is a bone." So I guess maybe the question to put to you is, in your own thinking, in your own work, what is spirit?
Yeah. Okay. It's a difficult. On one end, it's a simple concept, and on the other end, it's a difficult concept. The typical bifurcation or the typical dualism we're dealing with is, let's say, spirit and nature or spirit and matter, right? So, and that's a dualism. So you have the spiritual universe, which is sort of non-material or immaterial or some mental phenomena, mind phenomena, versus nature, which is material, which is physical, which is, all of these signifiers get attached to that. What Hegel means when he says spirit is a bone is he says that it's basically saying that there's a contradiction between spirit and matter, and that it's both at the same time. So you can't reduce spirit to matter, and you can't reduce matter to spirit, that they're mutually implicated with each other. There's a contradiction between the two of them. And what that means practically. So this is very practical. And this comes up in the preface of the Sex, Masculinity, God book I wrote with Kevin and Daniel, which is usually we think, let's say, sex is material and spirit is sort of non-sexual or something like this, that that money is material and spirit is it's not related to money, or material is involved in games of power, and spirit is sort of abstracted away from that or elevated above that. And when Hegel says spirit is a bone, what he means is that the deepest spiritual knots or the deepest spiritual problems for the subject also involve the body. Like spirit is a bone, but it also involves the body, right? It also involves sexuality. It also involves money. Sex is spiritual. Money is spiritual. Power is spiritual. You can't just create this bifurcation line. And this is actually also, this affects people's self-notion, because if you look at the traditional bifurcations in the ancient world, what happens oftentimes is spiritual people will leave the games of sex, power, and money, and they'll go to a Sangha, or they'll go to a monastery, right? They'll abstract themselves away from the everyday world of the rabble. They know that there are problems of sex, power, and money, which create deep antagonisms and deep emotional issues within their spirit. And so then they run away from it. They try to escape it. But Hegel's saying, no, you can't do that. That you're running away from the very becoming of spirit if you do that. So hopefully that's a good answer.
Yeah, no, it's great because it ties together the two threads that we just had open quite nicely. I mean, I can kind of recognize from my own journey of becoming, you might say, that initially the turn towards discovering spirituality, towards studying philosophy, towards meditation was precisely as a way to respond to the painful problems of power, sex, and money, in the sense of, oh, well, if I go here, then maybe it's going to release me from those. And but one of the things that I think we noticed on the retreat that we've just been on, it was actually doing work around this problematic triad of sex, power, money, that brought the community into its kind of deepest, you might say, spiritual unity with itself.
Exactly.
There's something in the way that encouraging subjects to reflect on these three, and I don't know if these are the kind of absolute three, but there's something impossible in these three, or something deeply, deeply disturbing in them.
Yeah, I don't think we should absolutely reify those categories, although sex is pretty deep and power is pretty deep. Money is probably the most easy to historicize as a category. And like could be historicized potentially. It's harder to but when you talk about, for example, Slavoj Žižek's sex and the failed absolute, and also Hegel and a Wired Brain, he does sort of attempt to historicize, or at least approach the idea of the historicization of sex. But it's very hard to actually think that. I think it's better I think we could presuppose that these categories could be potentially historicized. But for the time being, I think we need to work with them directly. We have to work through them rather than avoid them. And potentially working through them, we could, they could become less significant or insignificant. It's easy to imagine, for example, having certain working through of money to the point where it's just no longer a spiritual problem for you. There are many people who are in that situation. It's much harder to do that with sex, although there are people who are in that situation. Power, probably even more difficult.
Well, then I guess even with power, like power is kind of an abstraction, but there's questions of violence, domination, submission that are kind of perhaps more concrete below that abstraction that are fucking complicated to think through. And then they overlap with sex as well.
Violence is another good category to work through.
Yes.
Yeah, killing, death, these types of thinking through these. And like what I tried to emphasize in our circle where we were working with those categories directly was, you want to sort of see these categories. Why are these categories problematic? You want to see these categories as partial object fixations of your identity as a whole. And what that means is that these partial objects can disrupt your identity as a whole, right? Like, so for example, I have my notion of Cadell as a whole. And there could be some problem, like, for example, when I had a breakup with my first or third girlfriend or my second girlfriend, that it just disrupts my entire psychic economy. I'm totally disturbed, I'm totally broken. Same thing with money. You could reach, for example, a point where, your bank account reaches zero, or you're going broke, or you don't know how to make ends meet. And this can totally disturb your entire psychic economy. Or, for example, if you just can no longer afford to balance the requirements of your creative pursuit and your need to make ends meet with rent or food, right? So these partial objects, focusing on these it's a paradox where your whole identity depends on these partial objects that you have to work through in order to actually become, I don't know if whole is the right word, but in order to become, more, if you're not paying attention to these things, you can become undermined from within.
What happens to subjects who don't work through or pay attention to these partial object fixations?
I think you risk becoming infantilized and immature in certain dimensions. And so consequently, if you work through these are also the sources of maturity, potentially. Like, for example, I could tell a story of what the time I did go to a Buddhist center or retreat. And I was talking to a monk who had been there for 2 decades, and we got along really well. He was funny. We joked around. And at the retreat, a lot of young people were at this retreat, men and women. And this monk just leaned over to me and he was like, I can't take how many young women are here. Like I'm being disturbed inside. There's so many young women here. I'm not usually around this many. So what that means is that there's some sexual fixation he's struggling with, which is disturbing him, even though he's spent decades meditating and so forth. So the question is not just, do I leave society and go into meditative withdrawal, or do I go into the mess of life? I think the question is, how do we bring meditative withdrawal into the mess of everyday life, right? Like, what is the potential utility of something like meditation when it comes to dealing with intimate partner conflict, for example? Or, can that be helpful? But it's more thinking, again, spirit as a bone. It's not running away from this world, but rather going deeper into it.
Yeah, well, this reminds me of the ending of your essay, the reflective note for dialectical thinkers, that I've just been reading today, and which I'm planning to go through in our reading group next week, where you're kind of pointing to, I think if I remember right, perhaps the failure of the naive Platonic ontology on the one hand, but then also the turn towards a kind of non-dualistic ontology, which is becoming quite popular in the West today as well, but critiquing that as a sort of attempt to reach a static reality beyond the illusory notions or the illusory world of appearances. And perhaps I could just ask you to expand a little bit on that critique at the end of the essay, with reference to kind of what we're talking about here with the partial object fixations on sex, power, and money.
Sure. I'm not. I would have to go back to recall the specific section you're talking about, but the way this often comes up in my work is related to, on the one hand, we have, it's very, I want to stress this, and I hope this comes across in the paper, is that on the one hand, we have a very common and very ubiquitous, very tempting as well, negation of the idea of the one, which is typically associated with Plato. You have the one, which is the concept or the idea of the one. It's also, the thought of God. You could frame it like that. And oftentimes we have this as the foundation of Western culture. It's the footnote upon which all the rest of Western culture is written. And especially in the modern world, we have this temptation towards negating this, getting rid of this, overcoming this, transgressing it. And usually what happens is you have a certain affirmation of multiplicity. So we no longer have the one, but we have a multiplicity. And I think that where this idea of multiplicity comes in and is the one is problematic as well. So there is a need to sort of work with this, also deconstruct it, not have a sort of naive, reflective stance towards it, and so forth. There are big problems with that, which I could go into. But this affirmation of multiplicity, especially, which can also come up in non-dual sort of approaches to things, has its own problems. And I think that what sort of unifies both this naive one and the naive multiplicity is the inability to deal with antagonism and tension as it relates to sex, power, and money, many other things, violence. We could use many categories. The crucial thing is this capacity to think tension, this capacity to think antagonism. So on the one hand, with the idea of the naive one, I can just use this example with let's stay to the root. I could use the example of sexuality. when you have the idea of the one, you can form a naive concept of the one, and you can project that onto the other. And then you can see any tension or any antagonism internal to that unity as proof that that unity is flawed, and as proof that that unity needs to be deconstructed and critiqued and negated and so forth. This makes relationships impossible. On the other hand, if you go towards a pure multiplicity, you just go one by one, right? Or you just, you have no stable one at all. You're just this shifting, and that I think reflects more, of course, modern digital culture, more modern dating culture, where you just see multiplicity of partners. And what's often obfuscated in the ideology of this multiplicity is the inherent antagonism or heartbreak of this multiplicity itself. You have people who will market themselves as dating coaches or pickup artists or whatever, who don't really see the antagonism of the multiplicity, but just sort of, it's just a pleasurable free-for-all of one by one and so forth. So I think what's at stake here, and if we're taking it back to the non-dual as well, is that there's this tendency to find some sort of ontology, whether it's the one, whether it's the multiplicity, whether it's the one non-dual, which prevents us from dealing with the inherent rupture of ontology as such, the division, the gap, the tension in things. And so, and what's being called for in this tension in things is that, it's the capacity to think. You have to think with this tension.
Oh yeah, well, that reminds me of if I'm understanding parts in that chapter correctly, this idea that, say, if you look at the transition from the classical religious subject to the modern secular subject, the classical religious subject aims towards some imaginary ideal that might be embodied in a character like the Buddha or the Christ, but continually fails to immanentize the becoming of that ideal. And it's precisely in that that failure that historical reason begins to operate and starts to think and starts to go, what's going on here? What is this religion? What is the subject's relation to the religion? And successively, through a lot of deep thought and through a lot of deep philosophy, precisely in this crack, something like the secular subject is born, which you then uses the philosophy of the Enlightenment to go, actually, perhaps that whole ideal, perhaps that whole story was incorrect. Perhaps we need an entirely new way of thinking, an entirely new way of knowing, i.e. scientific rationalism, in order to frame a new relation of subjectivity to being itself. But then we, of course, wind up with where we seem to be at in the 21st century, where we're going through an analogous breakdown to the breakdown of the relationship of the classical religious subject with its ideal, in that the secular subject, the Enlightenment subject, which aims towards a fully, you might say, rational scientific ontology, is the crack is widening, whether it's, say, in the mental health crisis, or it's in the meaning crisis, or it's in the environmental crisis. The tools of thought just aren't working. And that's where we're kind of at as philosophers and thinkers and artists, is actually trying to do the messy work of thinking and cracking precisely in the breakdown. Yep.
I think that, and in this, there's always this temptation to go back to the religious subject. There's always this temptation to go back. You see, and I don't need to name names, but there are many people in our intellectual circles which see the crack in the secular subject, the meaning crisis and so forth, and they have a temptation to go back to some sort of ancient one or some religious form of subjectivity. But the Hegelian point there is that form of subjectivity has already failed. The birth of the secular subject occurs in the crack of the religious subject's failure. And then the question is, and then now you think about, okay, what is the notion of the secular subject? The actualization of the notion of the secular subject appears in movements like communism or fascism, where those are full political economic ideologies, which are attempting to actualize a replacement notion to the religious notion of Christianity, of Islam, of whatever religion you like, as a full social notion. And we know communism failed, we know fascism failed, and now we have a type of universal capital, basically. but we don't really have a notion of the subject in universal capital except for the neoliberal subject, which is just reducible to simple pleasures, to partial fixations, to individualistic, narcissistic self-enclosure, and so forth. So there's still this need to think, okay, we can't go back to the religious subject. And this is why Nietzsche is important, I think. We also have to acknowledge the full failure of the secular subject. And then the question is, where really are we? Without these, where really are, without going back to previous identities which worked for historical subjectivity. We have to think new identity, but also we have to, it's all complex. You also have to sublate identity. You can't just do cheap negations of religion either.
Enter the alien.
Enter the alien is ultimately where my mind goes. But and practically speaking, what does that mean? Enter the alien. It's trying to read. So here's the important philosophical lineage I follow. What really sucked me into philosophy was Slavoj Žižek, and I knew there was something important in Žižek's thought, and I wanted to go to the core of it, and I wanted to know how can I really contribute here, because I think there's something critical for 21st century thought here. Žižek's basic move philosophically is saying that we think in terms of a linear teleology from Hegel to Marx as it relates to the concept of alienation. And he says in this transition from Hegel to Marx with the concept of alienation, Marx distorts Hegel's original notion of alienation, which is that Marx thinks about alienation as you can resublate alienation into a harmony, meaning, yes, you're an alienated subjectivity in modern capital, but we can resublate this to the notion of communism, right? So we can have a fully secular subject, but we already said that secular subject, that project failed. So we have to think, going back to the original notion and reading closely, what does Hegel mean by the concept of alienation? I think what's clear that comes out especially if you read the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, alienation is not something that can be resublated to regain the one, even in a secular form of a political organization like communism. Alienation is almost a gift. You have to go deeper into alienation. Alienation is actually, where you explore the new identity. What are you alienated from? You're alienated from your current identity. Alienation is something where you're going deeper into an otherness of identity, and we have to train our thought to be able to do that, which involves emotional negativity and getting out of this idea that you can resublate to the one.
Getting out of this idea that you can resublate to the one. And yet, in your thought in that essay, you don't want to discard with the notion of the one per se.
No.
So what's going on with that? What's in that dialectical move?
What's in that dialectical move is an attempt to go into the otherness without totally falling into a spurious multiplicity. Because I think that's the dominant ideology in neoliberalism. I think the dominant ideology in neoliberalism is we get rid of any notion of the one and we can just lose ourselves in a spurious multiplicity. But why is it spurious? And this is where we need Hegel's science of logic, is that it's basically, it's a dead end of endless, meaningless objects. It's actually the spurious multiplicity, which is the cause of the meaning crisis. Like what I mean by endless, meaningless objects, you can always have another chocolate bar. You can always have another sexual partner. You can always have another stupid pleasure, whatever it is, that stupid masturbation habit, stupid, whatever it is your stupid fixation is that gives pleasure. It's a spurious multiplicity in the sense that there's no real end to it and there's no real deepening of spirit. So keeping on to the one and still going into the otherness at the same time, for me is at least that's what I try to embody. And that's my attempt to both, I'm not in a traditional one, which that's a whole other problem. Like, for example, let me give very concrete examples of the traditional one problem. Is I would have two older men who I respect, who have been married or together with one partner for, decades. And I would ask them, if your partner died before you, what would you do? And they would say, I would just kill myself. My identity couldn't stand on its own, right? It's totally fixed on this one. I can't even exist without this one, right? So you've totally fixed your understanding. You've totally fixed your identity onto this one, and you can't self-stand on your own. So I don't think we should go to this traditional one. I think that shuts down thinking, but we still have to have some notion of the one as we go into otherness or as we go into alienness. This is anyway, I'm not saying I'm correct. I'm saying this is just, this is where my thought finds itself.
Yeah. So there's something to save, to hold on to into this this aspiration for oneness. But like you said, it's not this just like naive oneness of, say, the perfect relationship, or even like the total ontology where God created being and that's just the way it is, and it's always going to be an eternal repetition of that.
Right.
So,
right. And that one, I'm using sexual examples because I think that's close to the bone, so to speak. Spirit is a bone, but this also just applies if you divide yourself down to your own personal identity as let's say, individual, like where there are people who could say, the one is my ego representation, that I exist in the realm of the big other, my work, my marriage, my government name, but I can just abandon this identity totally and, play with a multiplicity of different identities. What happens though is that these multiplicity of identities, they're insubstantial is the problem. They're actually an escape. It's a form of escapism, as opposed to a deepening of spirit, I suppose. What that deepening of spirit is related to idiosyncrasy, it's related to novelty, it's related to what has never existed before, the alien, the other.
Right. So there's that concept that you sometimes use, which is of a weird one. And it reminds me of, conversations we had last week around originality as a thinker, as a philosopher, as an artist. Like, why is it actually really difficult to say or think or express an original idea? And that's kind of linked to the historical oddness or weirdness of the paths and characters of many of the people who do stand out as having said or done something original. Precisely because there is a becoming of weird oneness.
Yeah. So let's say this is about thinking about the path of differentiation as such. So let me give an example. When we think of Buddhism, we tend to think of the state of nirvana, or we think about the ultimate state of transcendence, enlightenment, whatever word you want to attach to it. But what's essential to include from a Hegelian point is the path of differentiation of the Buddha. So the Buddha story, right? So the story of the Buddha is, we have a prince who is enclosed in basically an imaginary perfect world. He has no thought or concept of death. He has no thought or concept of hunger, of old age. And this illusion breaks. And then he goes on to his path where he tries to discover what he really is in and for himself. And then we get to eventually the transcendent state. The thing with differentiation is that no one path is the same, but we have to think the idiosyncrasy of this path in a totally new historical context, right? Like, we're not living in whatever century it was, ancient India. We're living in an insane global networked world, technological age, with all sorts of historical products of science, which totally changed the way we can differentiate. Just look at what's happening right now. I don't even know who I'm talking to. I don't even know where on the planet these people are. This is not a ancient Indian Sangha where all these people are just gathered around from the market over there. So there's something totally qualitatively different, which is opening up, which we're participating in, which we are co-creating, which needs to be thought philosophically. And it needs to be thought philosophically, not because we're smarter than ancient world spiritual teachers, We're probably not smarter than ancient world spiritual teachers. The thing is that they're not here, we're here. And this is happening now. We have to think this has not happened before.
Mm. It reminds me of that thing that it's always time to think the real. I think that's on one of your websites, right?
Yeah, that's what I've sort of condensed onto. Yeah.
It's like this. It's dawning on me more and more that like the task and the challenge of actually really thinking, as opposed to just regurgitating, say, whatever concepts or ideas or ideologies or philosophies have gone before, in a sense of trying to make sense of the present, as opposed to, say, actually really trying to look at the negative space as the as the horizon.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think if you could condense, I've just been going through some passages today. If you could condense Hegel in a very short way for people, in a way that's not superficial, in a way that's could really take your thoughts somewhere, it's that what Hegel opens up is this universal negative space, which is the positive condition of differentiation. And precisely to be thought. Like Hegel is there's no doubt that Hegel is privileging thought, specifically rational thinking as it relates to thinking through conflict, thinking through things that you have no idea what to think. Where if you're really thinking for a Hegelian, you should be kind of constantly in a state of disturbance.
Yeah, well,
you kind of constantly be in a sort of emergency.
It reminds me of a formulation I hit on in a podcast a few months ago, where I was like kind of thinking of narratives of progress and narratives of decline as two sides of the same thing. Like in both a progress narrative, you kind of have a naive assumption that everything is getting better all the time. And you might look at the kind of enlightenment story as part of that. And then the decline narrative is that, well, everything's getting worse all the time. So that might be the kind of typical conservative narrative, but also the more popular, say, environmentalist narrative that the world's are going to end in 30 years because of global warming and so forth. The really weird thing is to be in the middle space, that maybe we're neither progressing nor declining, but we're just in that weird space of becoming other to what we were before.
Yeah, I think there is a notion in Hegel of a sublation, of a progress of some kind. And like, you do have to sort of think about, okay, what is the meaning of the difference between the human being in a hunter-gatherer state versus a human being in a advanced technological global infrastructure and something? What's going on there? But at the same time, this dynamic and dialectic between the progress and the do you call it the decline?
Yes.
Yeah, between the progress and the decline, there is a dialectic there where in the progressive dynamic, something is coming to be. And in the decline dialectic, something is ceasing to be. And we have to think that. And when you fully think that, you do find yourself in this weird space, contradictory space, where it's like, I like Alenka Zupancic's word is object disoriented ontology. You're kind of disoriented. Like, I don't know what's up, I don't know what's down. And I've been in that space, like we kind of joked at the retreat when I was talking about in my doctoral thesis. I said, my time form collapsed. What that means is kind of I became disoriented. So this is a space which is, but at the same time, I think once you're in this disorienting space and you're sort of comfortable being disoriented, there is still like I don't want to go there, I'd like to go there. Like no, like there still is negation, like no, I'm not going there.
Yeah. Listen, Andrew, are you there? Do you want to chime in with anything? We're at like quarter to 9 now, and I think we'll go to general.
No, I'll definitely chime in. Yeah.
Hang on just a sec. So we'll go to general Q&As at 9 p.m. So guys, start thinking of your questions and chucking them in the chat if you want to say them. If none of them show up, then I'm just going to start asking people to ask a question. So save yourselves by putting some questions in the chat. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, I want to put. We've been studying Gurdjieff a little bit here in this group, and I want to put Gurdjieff against Hegel. Gurdjieff had an ashram he called the Center of Development of Harmonious Man, And the theory was that all of these different forms, let's say religious forms, develop a certain part of the human being, but not the whole human being. So there's the way of the faker, which is like the physical body, embodied reality. There's the way of the monk, which is kind of what you're describing in terms of going to the forest and meditating. There's the way of the yogi, which is sort of attention and mastery of the mind. And then he said all these things are part of the historical development, and he called it the fourth way. And the fourth way was about combining all three. And we talk about the logos, the pathos, and the mythos. But his idea was that there is a possibility of developing harmonious man. It's not purely a negation. And it seems to me like that I want to put like his idea of harmony against your idea of negation and sort of include them both or something like that. Am I making any sense here, Cadell?
Well, you're not understanding that Hegel is not stopping at negation.
Well, what I hear you saying most of the time is what we want to do is look at what's off with the alien.
No, so if you interact with what I actually say, I just said that if you could condense Hegel into something very simple, it would be he opens up a negative space within which positive differentiation unfolds.
Yeah. Right. So again, that's what I find similar to Gurdjieff, because similar in Gurdjieff's meditation, you meditate on the negative parts of yourself, like your mechanical reactions. He calls it machine man. You meditate on machine man, like your machinal qualities. So it's different than sort of like the kind of meditation where you're trying to observe the space between things. You go right into your negativity. You go right into that. But there is a notion of kind of, of enlightenment, of arriving somewhere. That's my only point. Whereas I wonder about where you arrive at with Hegelian. This is just a question. I'm not expert.
In terms of modern philosophy, I could just, I guess, derive from my studies of Less Than Nothing and Zizek it's kind of, you don't arrive in some static sense. You're kind of always arising. You're kind of always arriving, but every time you arrive, it's kind of a new one.
Yeah, sure.
You never arrive, and that's it. You're always arriving, and it's always a new one, or else there would be no possibility to go into the alien.
Mm-hmm. So, but why does that entail a negation of the religious forms, which are also always changing through history? I mean, isn't part of Hegel's idea that you have to also pass through the religious stage? Isn't that part of being a whole? This
right.
sort
So, Owen, can you help me out here, because it doesn't seem like Sweeney was even listening to what I said.
Okay. Hang on. Which bit do we need to clarify?
You can't just go right back to the religious notion, but you also can't just discard of it either.
Yeah. I think maybe like
you're against the idea of the one, that the one has to be kind of negated. Like we can't use religion anymore. That's failed. You said that is failed. You said that's
can I just come in here?
Yeah.
So I don't think we're like, I don't think Hegel, Cadell, or whoever is against the one, is that the one fails. Like, we tried the one. I tried the one in my first relationship. It turned out it didn't work. You can try the multiplicity as well and go into polyamory. And that can also, work for a while, but then you have this superficial enjoyment, and then it also fails because you want to deepen spirit in a, long-term relationship. So either like the many or the one, they don't seem to have the ultimate solution to our spiritual becoming, but we can work with their failures to become more mature subjects.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with that. By the way,
I gave the example. I gave a very practical example of a naive notion of the one. Again, if I speak sort of with nuance, complexity, and it's just sort of responded to very simply, very superficially, then it sort of even makes me feel like, why am I talking? The example I gave was, you could have this naive notion of the one where you've been with the same person for your entire life, and then I ask them, what would happen if this person died before you and they said, I would just kill myself, my whole identity would fall apart. The thing is when you fixate on the one in a very naive, superficial way, you're kind of closing thought. And if Hegel has one enemy, it's the intuitive one, where you just intuit the one as an immediate presence and you have no differentiation, you have no real mediation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in that sense, I think the spirit of Gurdjieff and Tantra in general is like that, because it's about going against the edge all the time and every moment. But it's also, he also talks about remembering the divine. Like he uses words like that. He uses the traditional words like being, remembering the divine, remembering the. So there's a positive. I mean, I guess it's like the rose. What Dimitri was talking about, that quote from Hegel, where you have the cross and the rose simultaneously.
I think if there's something like in my say understanding of Hegel against, say, Gurdjieff or some of the other spiritual teachers or religious philosophies, is the idea that some of the teachers and philosophies, there is a self towards which you are moving, towards you are discovering. There is kind of a one, and there is a truth. Whereas the whole point of the Hegelian revolution in philosophy is to move beyond this notion of there being a static self or a static divine. It's that the divine or the self manifests itself precisely through the failure of all the movements that aim towards it to immanentize itself. So the movement of the divine, for example, is precisely through the failure of Christianity, of Buddhism, of classical religion, and into secular society. And then the divine, or spirit, we might say, spirit is equally present in secular society. And especially now, spirit is present precisely in the way that secular society is failing and is falling apart. And spirit is partly present in the way that subjects are looking to teachers like Gurdjieff, like classical religion, in order to find answers. But these have to be thought through the failure of secular society itself, through the failure of modern society itself. So this is where there's a critique perhaps of the philosophy of traditionalism, which has become popular in the 20th century, the idea that modernism is somehow wrong or has lost something, and we need to return to a perennial wisdom, a perennial philosophy, a perennial truth. What it doesn't think is the way in which traditionalism itself is a thoroughly and totally modern phenomenon and would be totally unthinkable or meaningless in a world that has not gone through the secular move. And so this idea of like having to rediscover the divine, of having to rediscover the transcendent life, is already totally modern. And that's the way of thinking dialectically.
Well, that's where I disagree. I don't think that's totally modern in the least. I think that's all part of the apophatic path. I think the divine is always a dynamic process. It's never been a thing in Buddhism, and it was never never anything that could ever be reified. So yes, we always have to rethink the modern situation. But
well, there's a great paper in the Enter the Alien by a student named Quinn Whelan, who does a great job of juxtaposing Hegel and Buddhism. And the problem with Buddhism is just that it reifies the void. It says there's nothing to reify, but then reifies the void. And it's this negation of the negation, which opens up the thought of history, which is crucial.
But that's not Tantric and Dzogchen. That's Sutrayana Buddhism, yes, and which was already that was discovered within Buddhism. You know, that problem that you're describing was discovered within Buddhism. It's called Dzogchen. It's like it's a positivity that emerges from the negative.
But already we have to think about the real way that Buddhist societies, for example, failed relative to the Western colonial project. And then the way in which Buddhism is then being reabsorbed within the legacy of the Western colonial project in the Western nations, in Britain, in America, in Europe. And this is an entirely new form of, you could say, Buddhism that isn't thought within the classical doctrine itself.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what that entirely new thing is. I don't know what it is. So
I think we should open it up, Owen.
Well, Carl has got the first question. So if we're not going to, Carl, go on.
Thanks very much, Owen. So yeah, I'm really interested in this questioning, or the move from the one non-duality to the multiplicity. And yeah, just super interested in this sort of term of spurious multiplicity, and sort of painting it into a kind of quite a negative, dour light. But I just wanted to give some perspective on my own experience of receiving or entering multiplicity, because I've been part of the DMT trial at Imperial for the last 6 years. So I've been legally injected with DMT whilst having my brain scanned over many different phases. And the last phase was actually in the last summer, where I did DMTX, so DMT extended, where they drip feed you DMT and they can potentially keep you in that state permanently. So what was fascinating about that was, it allowed me to actually have a, from, I don't know if many of you have tried DMT, but it takes you to the astral. Your brain looks like you're dreaming. And that's what Imperial have found, even though you don't seem, it's not like dreaming in any traditional sense. But, we're having this experience of seeing light beings. Light is emanating from beings. So that's NMDMT. But 5-MeO-DMT is a pure sort of light space. You become light, you become completely non-dual. So I was having this sort of experience of seeing the non-duality at the bottom of my bed. And what's interesting and relevant about this is that I could see the non-duality, and I could see it as a sort of a black hole of this white space in the bottom of the bed. And it's almost like I could dive into it. But before that happened, it actually cracked. The non-duality cracked. And I thought, is it going to go back to a duality? But no, it actually revealed a multiplicity of non-dualities, of unities. And, it just felt like I'd been gifted this sort of key to understand that we are, if we talk about what is the deepening of spirit, I think it's this ability to shapeshift between these layers or dimensions of being. And I think those beings are us, we're kind of relating to light in these different layers, right? In the third dimension, we have light shining upon us. In the fifth dimension, on the astral, we have these light bodies. We are emitting light. But in the top of the pyramid, the 11th dimension, if you like, excuse the numbers, you are light itself. So you're pure non-duality. But what's producing the non-duality? And I just question this, whether it is multiplicity is the way to be looking at it, or this term transjective. And I know Andrew can explain that.
What's the question, Cole?
Just how the transjective relates to this, because I know Andrew did a whole paper on it, and it'd be good to understand if he thinks that, because I see...
That was John Vervaeke's term, transjective.
Yeah.
Which is like, I guess he's trying to redefine rationality as rationality not being a bunch of parts, that you kind of put together, but the sort of transcendental rationality, where the objective and the subject are both. There's a flavor of it, right? Where you don't transcend something without including it. And I don't know if I've got that right, and I don't remember my paper on transjectivity very well, but
yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think yeah, just fascinating conversation. But maybe I can ask Cadell why multiplicity is. Does he see it as something entirely negative, or is there scope?
No, I don't think I ever said I saw multiplicity as entirely negative, but I do say that there is a superficial way in which our current culture is falling into multiplicity. And I do feel like there's a way in which multiplicity, as enacted in sort of the ideology of neoliberalism, is, well, fundamentally destructive for a lot of young identities. And I mean, comparing your consciousness, where you're basically already an alien, you've already entered the alien, to culture at large and thinking historical spirit, they're two different questions. I mean, you've probably gone further into consciousness than 99.99999% of humans who ever existed, versus historical spirit as such, which is dealing with cultural, political, economic, and sexual issues. So it's the way I would describe it, and this is how I described it actually on my way back from my own DMT experiences, 5-MeO. So it's not that I don't have contact with these realities you're describing, but it's kind of what I would call the inversion of Stan Grof. So Stan Grof saw a lot of value in thinkers like Freud and thinkers like Jung. He was originally interested in the psychoanalytic problems, which are close to the body, close to sexuality. And then he stumbled upon psychedelics and thought that the psychedelics resolved the issues of psychoanalysis, that we could approach issues that psychoanalysis approached simply with the application of psychedelics. And I think this was a non-dialectical turn in a way that it sort of obfuscated the fact that many people who go off into psychedelics and just lose themselves in psychedelic trips still have enormous problems with sexuality, money, and power that are simply being obfuscated. And that actually the really difficult thing to do is to go into the psychedelic realm and come back and confront problems of my partner, day-to-day life with my partner, day-to-day life with how do I make ends meet, building a career, differentiating as a human in the world. These are problems which can't be resolved by simply taking more psychedelics, by getting a deeper drip feed, which permanently puts me into a crazy altered state of consciousness, which is not only non-dual, but non-dual and multiplicities of non-dual. I'm not saying those realities don't have a validity. I'm not saying those realities shouldn't be thought. I'm saying that those realities don't necessarily help us solve the problem of building out a historical spirit of global culture, which is capable of solving the problems of neoliberal global capitalism.
Thanks so much, Cadell. Yeah, I think it's. I always question it as well. Altered states for what?
Altered states for what?
Yeah,
and a lot of people are not very reflective about that. I'm not. And here, I want to differentiate between me and you, and I'm talking about the culture at large, because you, like I said, you're probably one of the most advanced thinkers, one of the most advanced psychonauts, probably is the best word, that has ever existed. But that's not representative of historical spirit.
Yeah, and just my final point, I think that idea, altered states for what? It's like we need to reach altered traits. We need to see real change that's lasting and not just sustainable, but regenerative.
Like what would here's what I'll say, Carl. What would impress me is psychonauts which were capable of coming back to the world and building out a different type of community related to sex, power, money, violence, all these difficult things of human spirit in a way that's orders of magnitude more advanced than normal human society. But I don't see that.
Yeah, you're right. But it is that idea that we do need to understand that these tools need to be used as catalysts for that context engineering that you're describing, those like creating new identities through the insight that you get. And unless you turn it into action, then it's just epiphany porn.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Right, Carl, I'm going to cut you off because I want to go to Hegel for our next question.
So, hi. My question is simply, what is a negative space? I think that would be useful for me to know.
So here's the thing, and this is what I taught at the French retreat, is that the meta sort of method in Hegel's thought is going from abstract to concrete, right? So when I say negative, that's extremely abstract, right? It's like, what is that? What are you talking about? Negative, right? But we're trying to get to concrete as possible. So the best way to get to as concrete as possible with the idea of the negative is death. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Everyone here is going to die. It's very concrete, right? Like, let me even get it more concrete. The most powerful experiences of my last few years has been being by my dad's side while he got told he had terminal cancer. That's as concrete as it gets. That changed our whole relationship. Or being by my granddad's side while he was passing away due to heart conditions. It's as concrete as you can get, and it changes your spirit as deep as you can get. What it means is that the space which unifies us is not a positive substance. We're not and think about the way in which this negative space is always unconsciously positivized. So in communism, how is it positivized? We're going to get to world communism. In religion, how is it positivized? We're going to see God when we die. right? Or think about how when I was growing up, I was interested in transhumanism. How is it positivized? We're going to be uploaded into machines into an infinite superspace. So always this negative space is unconsciously positivized. I would even say that you could also escape this negative space through psychedelics. I'm not sure if Carl would agree with me, but that would be sort of my interpretation, where you could just take a lot of psychedelics. You could endlessly expose yourself to psychedelics to avoid confronting death, to avoid confronting your actual relations where death is on the line. That's the negative space. And that's the space where Hegel's working. That's the space where Hegel's thinking.
Great stuff. All right, Yuri, do you want to go with your question?
All right, yeah. So one thing I see here is like two parallel discussions, sort of one focused on the phenomenological and another on like what is good thought. And so like, if I got it correct, Cadell, what you're trying to bring here is like good thought to make sense of the phenomenological. And so, okay. And basically you point out, if I get it correctly, you point out that like the promise of the one or the promise of the multiplicity as like being the final answer to our questions has like, all right, that doesn't work. And like, we need new types of thought that will like sort of arm us properly for what we're dealing with, because we know we cannot resolve all our issues with like one answer. And so basically my question / thought is like, we need a dynamic thinking instead of static thinking. And like one example of dynamic thinking would be Hegelian thinking, right? Which helps us think through the world in a dynamic sense instead of a static sense. So did I get this correct? And I would like to get your thoughts on like static versus dynamic thinking.
So yes, you got it correct. I just want to say that there are modern ideologies in one, Hegelianism can be turned into an ideology. Two, dynamic thinking can be turned into an ideology, and dynamic thinking emerges in what you said is correct. I just want to go into some nuances here that emerge and problems that emerge on the path. So dynamic thinking can emerge as an ideology. Even flow state psychology can be an ideology. What's crucial here, and this is the most essential point, and you pointed it out perfectly, is that to bring good thinking to phenomenology requires thinking the actual cracks in your day-to-day personal life and thinking and actually thinking these cracks. That's good thinking. So like, for example, like, let me give a very personal example, what happened last night. Okay, so this is away from ideology. These are things that are happening in your day-to-day life all the time. Okay, so yesterday I was in a bad mood because, embarrassingly, I have a sexual fantasy in my mind that I can't actualize with my partner. So I went into a depressive state, and my partner asked me, "Why are you so closed off?" And I didn't know how to talk about it. Right? So my closing up continued for a few hours. And finally she said, "I can't take it that you close up on me. I want you to open up." And we tried to build a safe space where I could talk about my sexual frustrations, my sexual fantasies, things that I wish could go differently, things that I wish we could try, things that I'm uncomfortable about, things I'm insecure about, and so forth. This is where thought is needed. Not just this example, but that's an example that happened last night. You know, these types of things is where we think. These are actually, and today we're having a fantastic time. We worked through that negativity together. It's not the end of the story, but this is the place where thought is needed. This is the place where new concepts are generated. This is a place where relationships are saved, extended, deepened, expanded. That's dynamic thinking. Dynamic thinking, again, you should be like I was describing. I was in a very vulnerable space. I'm in a very embarrassed space. I can't even stand my own self-reflection.
Okay, so like basically what you're saying here is like you need to make your thinking dynamic. You need to face the world with your thinking.
Absolutely.
That was sort of not what I was trying to get at. I was like trying to get at like thinking as abstraction, right? As like having good models of the world, maybe, right? And then like you have like frozen models, or you can have unfrozen models, right? And so the Hegelian model could be in a sense unfrozen. And so like I was getting more like at like having solid is the wrong word, but like having like proper abstractions, like abstracting well, right?
In a Hegelian sense, to abstract well means to become more concrete.
Okay.
So
Can you expand on that?
The simple method I was trying to describe it to, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce your name right, but Egil. I was trying to describe. You start, so like again, the concept of negativity is hyper abstract. What does that mean? A concrete example would be death that unifies us all. We're all going to die and so forth. The point is like, so for example, I'm feeling insecure, very abstract. I'm being insecure about a very concrete sexual fantasy, right? So it's becoming more concrete and dealing with concrete problems. I don't know what it is for you. You could probably, if we sat down over coffee and you were telling me about your day, you could tell me concrete problems you're dealing with, and we could, abstraction here would serve these concretions.
Yeah, makes sense.
Abstraction is in service of the concrete.
Yeah. Right. Let me cut off this line because I want to go. We've got some more good questions. So, Guise, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So my question is about spiritual authority, which you started your conversation with. So given if this is really the problem of our culture that we have now, is we don't have spiritual authority, we don't know how to recognize it. And given that what we've discussed now and going in depth into sex and death and power and money and all of these difficult things, but also Hegel's philosophy, like what can we say about how we can move towards a new kind of spiritual authority, or what this would look like, and also how this would appear outside of kind of the barred absolute, where you can talk about sex, money, power, and deep philosophy, but because what is to stop, like if something new were to emerge from these groups, and what is to stop, let's say, the outside world to kind of like position it as some postmodern, power hungry, just another kind of like that, yeah. So how is this cultivated? How is it discerned? This is just something I'm wondering about.
I mean, in some sense, it's I don't know what to think about this inside outside distinction in regards to, the outside world getting in and stuff. At the same time, we are kind of this enclosed, obscure, esoteric little online network. But I guess I think about we're always in, like we can't get out in some. So I want to make that distinction. There's no escape. We're in this world, and we're in a sort of neoliberal techno-capital environment. We can't escape this. We have to work through this. But in terms of authority, what would that look like? I mean, I think it has to do with including within our knowledges, our discourses, our currency, basically. I mean, I'm talking about certain philosophies and stuff like that. I develop a philosophy portal platform, is building within these knowledges and discourses the history of the spirit, and that the history of the spirit has some weight. It has some, it can't be measured. It can't be measured, but it would come out in it would come out in simply the capacity of spirit to serve very specific concretions, and the capacity of spirit to also know where it cannot serve concretion, right? So like, for example, if someone is really well educated when it comes to esoteric Eastern wisdoms, but they haven't studied philosophy, and then they try to apply their knowledge to philosophy, this would be an example of someone who's unwise, right? So we have to have people whose spirit can demonstrate in its live and spiritual speech that it can serve specific concretions because of the weight of its history. Like, for example, I've gone through struggling deeply with monogamy and polyamory and all sorts of those types of love relationships. I can speak to those problems. If we're over coffee, I can listen to those problems. My thought can serve those problems, not perfectly, but and I know where my limit is as well. I don't know much about Eastern spiritual, esoteric wisdoms and so forth. That's not my area of expertise. If you're looking for something like that, look somewhere else and so forth.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that's interesting. So it's really where in the capacity to deal with very concrete issues, things, just real life, where this manifests. Yeah.
Yeah, and also I think it's the return. And when I say the respect of the historical spirit, and I've said this before in conversations with Owen, it's a respect for intergenerational and developmental dynamics, meaning my age, my position in spirit. I know that Owen is younger than me. I have a certain responsibility to him. I'm older than him and so forth. And there are also people who are older than me who should have a certain responsibility to me, whether or not they do act like that or not. So we have to bring back historical, intergenerational, developmental transition of knowledge. We're not just abstract minds that have knowledge. I'm a concrete human being. I'm trying to organize retreats with other people who are here, where we actually interact, have dinner together, hug each other, watch movies together, go on walks, just live human lives. Hopefully also going into the alien together. Maybe Carl will hook me up to a DMT drip feed and I'll just go into some non-dual space where I'll never return. Hopefully.
I'm sure that'll happen. All right, let me iPhone 4 had a question. I believe that is DK.
Yeah, DK.
Yeah, that's me. What's up? All right, so yeah, I'm quite scared to ask my question here. You can fry me if it's a stupid question, Cadell. Well, I guess what I get from this negative space, what I get from this is like, to be able to fail, you of course first need to try,
Yep.
and to be able to, and then to me that's like to be able to enter a negative space, you must, a positive space must have preceded it somehow. And to me that's like, for example, let's take a romantic relationship as an example. How, like, don't you have to sort of fool yourself into believing that your romantic partner is the one, to be able to open yourself up to actual failure? Like if you don't really believe that the other person is is the one, then the failure would not be as big, and hence the transformative potential will not be as big. And so, for example, in my own life, that's been quite present in when I make music. For example, when I was younger, I really believed that I could make the perfect song, and of course I didn't make a perfect song, but my transformation and my sort of development was way bigger than it is now. It's like, because when I enter, I don't enter with as much at stake, so to speak. And so I just wanted you to sort of, what's your thoughts on that?
It's a fantastic question. Okay. So first I want to say that in the paper that Owen's going to teach, I think, to the Parallax Sangha next week, I talk about my sort of historical lineage of thought that I try to work with, which is something like Plato, Hegel, Lacan, and Zizek. And the reason why I include Lacan over Hegel is because he doesn't only think about the sublation of the one, but he also thinks of the unconscious one. Okay, so that's crucial to your question about love and romantic relationships. I'll give a practical example. When my brother first fell in love, there was no rational, and it was a horrible relationship, a total disaster, but no rational argument I could give for him that would somehow break the illusion of the one. It had to break for him. There is a way in which there's something about our structural condition as whatever the hell we are, spirit, whatever you want to call it. There's something about the inherent structure of the unfolding or the development of spirit where we have to be duped by an illusion. We have to go through that illusion. I've gone through that illusion many times. It's been broken. The one has been broken. What happens in my experience is when this illusion is progressively broken, is we get a deeper awareness of the reflexivity of the unconscious. What that means is, and now that means you have to go through a phase of disillusionment, which is usually coupled with the expression of multiplicity, because there's no one, so I'll just go here and there.
Yeah.
But there's a way in which the deeper you fall into the multiplicity, in my experience, the deeper I went into the multiplicity, the deeper I knew I could hurt the other. Right? So I didn't only hurt in myself with the one, but I hurt the other. And that was irresponsible of me to hurt the other with the one. So then once you realize where you hurt inside yourself as pain, as an unbearable spiritual pain, and once you know where the other hurts in a deep, unbearable spiritual pain, then you can bring, in my view, a deeper awareness of the reflexivity of the unconscious, and you're still working with a one. And here's what Hegel writes, this is where Hegel writes that I like, where he talks about, he says, he's constantly, and this is the notion of sublation, there's always a more perfect one.
Right, yes.
Right? So now this is a paradox, right? Because more perfect one, because perfect one in Plato is just a perfect one. So what's the idea of a more perfect one? Right? That's the notion that is this becoming of the perfect one.
Yeah.
Right? And I experienced this in my relationship where I try to maintain a one that's in tension because it's just the reality. We're two people with differences and so forth. But in going into that negative space, now there is, like you said, if there's a negative space, there must have been a positive space before it, right? Right. So the first positive space with my partner was, well, I'm attracted to her.
Right.
Right. Like I could see myself in a relationship with her. Right. But as you go deeper into that negative space, the deeper the sublation, the deeper the one can become. And that's what people who are just in a mode of lust, in a mode of immediate gratification, they never get to that deeper one.
Right.
They just go one by one.
Yeah.
But the crucial thing with going from Hegel to Lacan is you have to include the unconscious, because Hegel is just really the ultimate philosopher of self-consciousness, whereas Lacan includes unconsciousness. And there's certain dynamic that is unfolding as it relates to sublation, which when you include unconsciousness, it's probably a more mature, there's this, what's happening, I think, in the history of philosophy is this, there is a maturation of spirit. Like spirit is becoming more mature, more aware of what it really is.
Right. Yeah. Well, no, I'm not going to comment. I think that was a great answer. There are probably other questions as well. Thank you, Cadell.
No, actually, there's no more questions in the chat box. So does anybody have anything? We're getting towards the end. Does anyone have anything that they haven't said yet?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have something.
I knew it was going to be you prostitute Hegelian.
Isn't the contradiction and equation of spirit as a bone taken up by spirit? Like there is an asymmetry which falls into spirit, right?
Yes.
Otherwise, we become object-oriented artists.
Yeah, it's asymmetric. No, that's crucial. That's crucial. So there's like with regard to nature and spirit, there's an asymmetry. Absolutely. I could go, and same with the idea. It's like however you want to divide it up, right? However you want to divide it up. Like I like the example of, for example, spirit and nature, where at the beginning of, and now think about science historically. Okay. So in the beginning of science, we have a type of unreflective materialism, right? Extended in space and time. This presupposes an asymmetry on the side of matter, right? Whereas we're just observing matter, we're filling up our spirit with matter by being able to mathematize nature, being able to mathematize our external universe, being able to locate ourselves in space and time. But then the asymmetry appears internal to historical spirit of science, which is we start to be able to absolutely transform matter, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, atomic manufacturing, even deeper forms of subatomic particle manufacturing, where spirit changes what matter is. So this asymmetry appears internal to the historical development of the scientific notion. And there we really confront spirit as a bone. Because then we, like, when you get into genetic engineering or atomic manufacturing, then you're really working with the bone. You're not just like doing a archaeological observation and a classification of certain historical human forms or a certain sort of a phylogeny of the history of evolutionary biology. You're literally having the conceptual power to intervene in evolutionary processes and so forth.
Great stuff. All right, guys, we are almost at the half-hour mark, so it's time to look at wrapping up. Cadell, you've already hit about 500 home runs already in this 90 minutes. Cadell is sometimes lovingly referred to as the baseball philosopher or baseball Shiva, just constantly negating everything with his fucking bat. Do you have any final comments at Cadell?
My final comment would be just congratulations to Aaron Judge, who hit his 60-second home run yesterday, passing Roger Maris on the all-time home run list in the American League. And, some people are debating maybe the home run leader, home run king, considering that everyone ahead of him hit more home runs only because of the steroids and other tamperings. But shout out to Aaron Judge.
Shout out to Aaron Judge. Andrew, anything you want to say before I round it off?
Just that spirit as a boner.
Yeah, spirit is definitely a boner, yeah.
Oh God, my spirit has a boner. All right, guys.
Enjoy your boner tonight. Even if you're no fap, just enjoy. If you don't have a boner, enjoy your pussy.